Imagine a time when the wealth of an entire nation didn't come from gold mines, oil wells, or vast empires overseas, but from something as simple and humble as sheep. Yes, sheep. In the rolling green fields of medieval England, thousands of them grazed, their fleece growing thicker with every passing season. But this wasn't just wool, it was white gold. Wool became the engine that drove England's economy, the resource that filled the coffers of kings, and the reason why England rose to such wealth and power in the Middle Ages. Without wool, the story of England might have been very different. So, how did an ordinary animal transform a small island kingdom into a global economic force? Let's unravel the story. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was hungry for fine cloth. Across the continent, in places like Flanders and Italy, skilled weavers turned raw wool into luxurious textiles. But they needed high-quality fleece, and England had the perfect answer. The damp climate and lush grasslands of England were ideal for raising sheep, especially a breed whose wool was thick, soft, and incredibly versatile. Merchants from Europe quickly realized that English wool was unmatched in quality. Soon, bales of fleece began moving across the English Channel, sold at high prices, and eagerly bought by European towns that lived off the textile trade. In many ways, England became the pasture of Europe, and the looms of Bruges, Ghent, and Florence depended on the silent labor of English sheep. This trade was not small. By the 12th century, wool had become England's greatest export. Castles, cathedrals, and even wars were financed by the money it brought in. Every sack of wool that left the English coast carried with it a little piece of the nation's future. Kings taxed it heavily, monasteries produced it in huge amounts, and merchants built entire fortunes on its trade. The flow of fleece became a river of silver and gold pouring back into the kingdom. Wool wasn't just a product. It was the foundation of power. But why wool? Why not something else? The truth is, medieval Europe had an enormous demand for warm clothing and fine fabrics. Linen was common, but it couldn't provide the same warmth in winter. Cotton wasn't yet widely available, and silk was expensive, reserved only for the wealthiest nobles. Wool filled the gap perfectly. It could be woven into thick cloaks for peasants or fine tapestries for kings. Its flexibility made it priceless, and England was sitting on a treasure trove of it. In every marketplace, from small village fairs to great continental trade centers, English wool carried a reputation for excellence. Buyers didn't even need to ask where the fleece came from. The soft texture spoke for itself. Monasteries were some of the biggest producers. Picture vast abbey lands covered with flocks of sheep, watched over by lay brothers and peasants. These monasteries didn't just pray, they ran enormous sheep farms, turning their lands into economic powerhouses. The money they earned helped build the grand stone cathedrals that still stand today. Behind the beauty of medieval architecture was the humble fleece of countless sheep. When pilgrims gazed up at towering spires or passed through massive carved doorways, few realized that it was sheep's wool that had paid for the stone, the glass, and the labor. Religion and economics walked hand in hand, and sheep provided the bridge between faith and fortune. The crown also saw opportunity. Kings realized that controlling the wool trade meant controlling the lifeblood of the kingdom. Heavy export taxes were introduced, known as customs duties, which filled royal treasuries. Some rulers even banned raw wool exports at times, forcing foreign merchants to buy directly under crown supervision. Wool became so important to the monarchy that in Parliament, the Speaker's chair rested on a giant sack of wool, symbolizing that the entire English economy sat upon this single product. The symbolism was clear law, and government itself rested upon the strength of sheep. With wealth came power. The revenue from wool allowed England to fund armies, expand its influence, and compete with rivals on the continent. When Edward III launched the 100 Years' War against France, much of the war chest was filled with taxes from wool exports. It was fleece that helped fuel England's ambitions abroad. Wool didn't just clothe people, it armed soldiers and built empires. Behind the clash of swords and the thunder of siege engines was the quiet echo of sheep grazing in the fields, their wool transformed into coin, and that coin into power. But the story doesn't end there. Wool also reshaped English society. Landowners realized that sheep were more profitable than peasants. A flock of sheep required fewer laborers than a field of crops, and the wool they produced could fetch high prices abroad. This gave rise to a shift known as enclosure, where landlords pushed peasants off traditional farmland to make room for grazing sheep. Whole villages disappeared as pastures replaced plowed fields. For the peasantry, this often meant hardship, but for landowners, it was the key to greater wealth. England's green fields became battlegrounds of survival, where the quiet transformation of farmland into pasture meant the difference between a peasant's home and a nobleman's fortune. Merchants, too, became powerful. A new class of English traders emerged, linking local wool producers with continental buyers. These merchants often grew rich, sometimes richer than minor nobles. Their influence helped create England's early urban centers as ports and market towns flourished with the wool trade. Cities like London, Bristol, and especially the eastern ports thrived as wool made its way abroad. Wool money wasn't just padding the purses of kings and lords. It was building the foundation of a new kind of economy. The rising merchant class planted the early seeds of capitalism, showing that trade, not just land and titles, could be the true source of wealth. Across the Channel, English wool fueled the booming textile industries of Flanders and Italy. The great cloth towns of Bruges, Ghent, and Florence depended on English exports. Their prosperity was England's prosperity, creating an economic bond that was both profitable and politically powerful. At times, this dependency gave England leverage in diplomacy, because cutting off the wool supply could cripple foreign economies. The fleece of English sheep became a quiet weapon of influence, stronger in some ways than any sword or treaty. When disputes arose, threats of restricting wool exports could silence rival towns more quickly than an army ever could. And yet, the wool boom wasn't without its risks. Dependence on a single commodity made England vulnerable. If markets collapsed, if wars disrupted trade routes, or if demand declined, the entire economy could wobble. Still, for centuries, wool remained the safe bet, the constant flow of riches that made England resilient through much of the Middle Ages. Wool merchants even began forming powerful guilds and companies, pooling their resources to ensure stability and profit. These organizations laid the groundwork for future trade companies that would one day fuel England's overseas expansion. It's also worth noting how much wool shaped culture. The very image of England became tied to sheep and pastures. Literature, records, and even art of the time often praised the wealth of the flocks. Shepherds appeared not just as humble caretakers but as symbols of prosperity. The phrase, "wool is our gold," wasn't just a metaphor. It was a truth known to every merchant, monk, and monarch. The prosperity of the nation wasn't found in mines or foreign conquest, but in the quiet grazing of animals across green hills. Travelers who crossed England in the Middle Ages often remarked on the endless sight of sheep and the constant movement of wool carts heading toward ports. By the late Middle Ages, England was firmly established as the wool capital of Europe. Its economy was more stable, its monarchy more powerful, and its society more dynamic, all thanks to wool. The fleece had done what armies sometimes could not. It had secured England's place as a rising force in Europe. Wool's legacy was not temporary. It left a mark on the very structure of English law, society, and identity. Even as new industries rose centuries later, the foundations built by wool remained. Looking back, it's astonishing to think that one product, produced by one animal, could hold such power. But wool wasn't just about material wealth. It was about transformation. It turned local pastures into engines of international trade. It gave ordinary peasants livelihoods, monks power, and kings the means to fight wars. It connected England to the broader European economy and set the stage for even greater expansion in the centuries to come. So, why did England grow rich and powerful from wool in the Middle Ages? Because wool was more than fleece. It was the fabric of prosperity. It clothed the continent, it filled royal coffers, and it gave England the strength to rise. From the smallest village to the grandest cathedral, from humble shepherds to mighty kings, the story of medieval England is woven together by wool. And even centuries later, when we look at England's wealth, influence, and identity, we can still trace its threads back to those flocks grazing quietly in the fields, their simple fleece changing the fate of a nation forever.